We should have elevator music playing.
Well, you could just sing, Carol, if you want.
Wait, I got Spotify. Let's see what's playing here. Taj Mahal. There we go. All right, enough of that. Jim, I meant to bring by, I found the HCP cost estimate. It was in the committee meeting notes for October 1st, 200,000 or more.
Yeah.
There
So
we go.
Your memory was correct.
Oh,
And we do have
once.
it. Well, we don't need to get into that debate publicly now, do we? It's always better than mine.
The recording has started, Carol, so we're good whenever you are.
All right, well, let's be timely and get started on time. Good afternoon, everybody. And thanks for joining us. Thanks to Jody and Sean at Stearns County for setting up the system, the go-to meeting for this webinar. My name is Carol Andrews. I work for Jim Foldesy in St. Louis County as an environmental project manager. And as Jody mentioned, this is being recorded, so we can post it along with other information for people to reference or watch if they weren't able to join us today. The agenda today, which I decided we could call a webenda, you combine a webinar and an agenda, you get a webenda. It's a new word. Has three main parts followed by Q&A or discussion as time allows. We have a lot of information packed into the hour and a half. We have scheduled, I think we have time until 3 if people want to stay after class. But let's see if we can get done by 2:30 with at least the main presentation and a few questions. I put up here CCAA equals candidate conservation agreement with assurances because we don't have time to keep saying the whole thing throughout the presentation. So you're going to hear that CCAA over and over. So step 1, memorize that. And then the presentations we've divided into 3 sections. The first is updates, background info that hopefully will help everything else make sense. The main meat or tofu of the day, I think, is part 2, where 4 counties are going to share how their county has gone about learning about the CCAA, making a decision. 3 of us have started work or have even applied for coverage under the CCAA. So that's part 2. And then part 3 is a little more detail on risks, benefit, and costs of becoming a Monarch CCAA partner and making that decision, because it's a voluntary program, so it's something everybody needs to decide. So first update is just the committee update. As you might recall, MCEA decided to form a committee to dig into the Monarch CCAA with the idea of trying to save people time, because it is no small, 3-page document everybody can read and take care of quickly. It is complicated. It's not the most complicated thing you'll have to do this year, but there is something to it. So that's why the committee was formed. These are the committee members. We have Darren from Carver, Jim, Lance Robertson, and myself from St. Louis County. Sean helped quite a bit from Stearns County, and Jody as well. Kay, Ben, Chad with Olmsted, Joe Triplett at Chisago, Rob at Crow Wing County, and then 3 MnDOT staff have been also helping quite a bit, Lisa, Sulman, and Christopher Smith. The committee started by assessing the costs versus the benefits of becoming a partner. And at first we thought we were going to really have to do a lot of, number crunching on it, but it pretty quickly became apparent to the committee members, at least, that the benefits appear to outweigh the costs for all of us. So, and a couple of things we looked at there was some cost benefit studies, and you can find these on the toolkit. I'll show you the link to it in a little bit, but where 5 potential CCAA partners, I think they were all state DOTs, did a cost benefit study and found that even if the Monarch wasn't listed, that some of the changes they would make would pay off. And if it's listed, then it's a slam dunk. And then just cost and time to develop one of the alternative tools called a habitat conservation plan. Just like we'll get back to in a minute, the timing and things don't seem like it's as advantageous. So having come to that conclusion, a lot of the committee time, and we met twice a month, was then spent on getting educated, mostly by Chris Smith, on various aspects of the CCAA, and then we started digging into preparing applications. The deliverables, as I call it, coming from the consultant side, include documents that will be posted soon. Sulman has agreed to help us post them on the MnDOT state aid website. We're still open to comment, but the committee thought that would be a little bit more accessible and useful, easier to do than using the MCEA's own website. That was another option. So we'll include these webinars. Probably most important things are the example applications for coverage under CCAA, representing different parts of the state. County board presentation examples you'll see. And I'm working on FAQs specific to Minnesota counties, because even though there's a FAQ that talks about the CCAA sort of at a national level, people have asked questions that I want to make sure we capture those answers to. And then these webinars will be posted there as well. So that is what the committee has been up to. And before we jump into other things, I've realized every time I meet, say like internally, or first try to talk to somebody about the Monarch CCAA, there's 3 questions that tend to come up that are, I think if any of these are stuck in your head, it's hard to take in more information because it just doesn't make sense. So things to address right off the bat, and I just put this in there. We're not talking about bats, thank God, we're just talking about monarchs. But anyway, the first one is roadsides. What the heck, that can't possibly be good monarch habitat. They're just gonna get run over. So I'm gonna address that one and then hand this over to Chris Smith to answer the other 2 questions. And what I found reading the CCAA document is that many references to studies, and it has a huge compendium of references to the specific studies, but that if you look at the amount of area covered by transportation right away, so that's rails, roads, as well as energy, it's millions and millions of acres. This probably exceeds the size of Minnesota's 55 million acres. You're getting up to that amount of area. So it's significant area that is generally managed to prevent growth of trees, which puts it in what they call a perpetual state of early successional habitat. If you're a plant nerd, that's what they call it. So, it looks like grassland or a meadow. Those type of habitats are in decline for various reasons in the monarch territory, and they are needed by monarchs, and other species depend on them. And yes, there is, you do get monarchs in the grill of your truck or whatever, but the net benefit, if you can double the number of monarchs and 10% of them are getting killed, you still get a net benefit. So that's my attempt to answer that, and what made me at least feel like, oh, okay, I get it. That part makes sense. So with that, Chris Smith, are you on the line? And I know you're having to call in from a parking lot before your 3 o'clock meeting. So if you can chime in on the next 5 slides.
Yep, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right. Yeah, so one of the questions that I frequently get is about this agricultural land and farming land use issue. And this is certainly, the elephant in the room. Fish and Wildlife and many other conservation NGOs that are concerned with monarch butterfly conservation know that we collectively, we will not be successful if agriculture doesn't participate and step up and help address the monarch butterfly decline. But it's important to know that there's research that, like Carol mentioned, point towards roads is also playing an important role. And Fish and Wildlife and other conservation NGOs are working with agriculture. And in fact, some of them are working towards a CCAA for agricultural lands as well. And so it's not that, road authorities are out there doing all the work. There are folks working on the agricultural front as well as the urban lands front. And so, it really is this all hands on deck approach. We need everybody participating, and there are folks working at every different land manager type out there. So just be aware of that. Second question that I get quite often has to do with just how common monarchs are. I mean, we're all pretty fortunate in Minnesota. We have a number of monarchs that occur in our state. You probably see them in your yard, whether or not you live in an urban area or out in a rural environment. You see them when you're driving around the state. And they are relatively common. There are millions of them in the eastern migratory population, but the research that's been going on for many decades shows that the population as a whole is declining. And we do have an example from not too terribly long ago of a species that was once so common that people didn't think we could possibly have an impact. And that's the passenger pigeon. It disappeared kind of in the early 1900s. By the probably mid 1920s, it was pretty much wiped out. And this was a species that, again, you go back to accounts from the late 1800s, and it was so common that it would darken the sky. It would be daytime, and if a flock flew over, it would feel like it had become night. They would block all the light. So, it is very possible that our actions can make a species that is very abundant disappear. And so it's not something that should be ignored. Next slide, please. And so switching gears just a bit, I want to provide a little bit of background for folks that may not be as familiar with monarch butterflies as some of us are or will become in the coming years. So the caterpillars, that's what you see here in the upper right. They feed exclusively on milkweed. I guess to take a step back, there are a couple non-milkweed plants that the monarchs will occasionally lay eggs on, but they're not successful at feeding and becoming adults. And so they do need milkweed to complete their life cycle. And that's, a really, important part of the monarch life cycle that DOTs and other linear infrastructure land managers have an important role to play, because we do have milkweed on many of our roadsides, whether we want it there or not. But another important aspect that sometimes gets forgotten or missed is the other nectaring resources that are important for the adults. And of those, really major importance are some of the fall flowering species like goldenrods and some of our asters, blazing star species. And that's because a lot of our monarchs in Minnesota in August or early September are the generation that are going to fly all the way back to Mexico, and they need the sugars from the nectar of these flowers to fuel their long trip south. Next slide, please.
And with this one, I was just pointing out that it's convenient that monarchs kind of all gather in one place, at least the eastern population gathers in one place area of Mexico so they can get counted, and how that's declining.
Yeah, and so you can see here, this is kind of the long term data set that most folks think about when they think about population trends within that eastern population. And as Carol mentioned, they all do go to Mexico and overwinter in a fairly small geography at high elevation in Mexico. There is a western population that overwinters primarily in California, and you may have heard some about that recently. This last winter's count in California was the lowest ever, and alarmingly low. But that population and the eastern population interact very little, and so they're essentially treated as two separate populations from a conservation standpoint. It's also worth noting before we switch slides that Fish and Wildlife Service has identified the 6 hectares as kind of the conservation goal. They feel if they can keep the overwintering size in Mexico to about 6 hectares on average, that they're relatively safe from extinction. So next slide, please. There we go. So as you may or may not be aware, Fish and Wildlife has been working towards a listing decision for several years now. It had been put off once. It was originally scheduled for June of 2019, but had been put off till December 2020, and they did make a decision. There's generally speaking kind of 3 listing decisions that Fish and Wildlife has to pick from, and that's what you see here at the top of the slide. So listing is warranted, and they propose a rule, so a federal rulemaking process to actually move forward with that listing. The next kind of most common is that they make a decision that listing is not warranted, and that kind of just ends the process. No rule is proposed, and the species doesn't receive protections under the ESA. But what Fish and Wildlife decided to do, or what decision they came up with, is that listing is in fact warranted based on the science that they reviewed and in the data they had access to, but it is precluded or delayed by other higher priorities. And so the key here is that listing is warranted. The situation for the monarch butterfly is serious, and assuming things don't get significantly better, Fish and Wildlife currently anticipates publishing a rule to list the species in federal fiscal year 24. They will assess the situation annually just to make sure things haven't gotten much worse, much faster than they anticipated. But as of right now, Fish and Wildlife will move forward with a rule to list the species in fiscal year 24 unless we can turn things around. So it really is the time to act. We have now a few more years to be proactive and try to recover this species. And if we happen to be successful, it's very possible that listing may no longer be needed by the time we get to 2024. That said, if a listing is still necessary based on the population trends at that time, it's a time to act from a regulatory standpoint to prepare for a future where this widespread species is listed and where there would be some regulatory requirements associated with the things that we frequently do, such as vegetation management and road construction projects. I think next slide.
All right, hang on. I think it's back to me. Chris, do you want to introduce, in case there's anybody on the line who hasn't worked with you, your role at MnDOT?
Sure, thanks for that. So I'm a wildlife biologist by profession, and I work in MnDOT's Office of Environmental Stewardship, where I review both MnDOT and locally led projects that have federal highway dollars for compliance under the Endangered Species Act, more often referred to as a Section 7 review. And so those of you that have federal highway dollar projects, you might receive letters from me describing the types of impacts that a project may have.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I was playing around with trying to mute my computer.
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, good. All right, back to me. I'm going to just quickly go over about 1/4 of the slides that were presented at webinar 1 as a reminder as to what is CCAA is. CCAAs in general are a voluntary pre-listing tool. They're a cooperative agreement between non-federal partners and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they provide incentives for proactive immediate conservation for at-risk species in exchange for then the Fish and Wildlife Service providing regulatory assurances to the entities participating that they can continue to do certain activities even if the species gets listed. So it's one of the tools in the toolbox, and this next slide kind of touches on that. A CCAA, you kind of hear this over and over, but it ensures regulatory certainty. Oh, Chris, Can you mute it all? Or somebody's not on mute. Thank you. Ensures regulatory certainty and maximize operational flexibilities for the partners in the CCAA in the event of listing by providing incidental take coverage. And keep in mind that take under the Endangered Species Act means harass, harm, kill, trap, capture. Also includes shooting, but I don't know that enemy would be shooting monarchs. But anyway, and the CCAA is just one way that an entity can get permission to take a listed species. Keep in mind that mowing that could impact either those nectar resources or milkweed would be an example of take that could impact the monarch. So other options include something called a habitat conservation plan. HCPs typically are completed closer to the listing or at the time of listing. And so the problem with those is you can end up with a gap between the listing and the HCP providing the take coverage. Another tool is to issue a 4D rule, which the Fish and Wildlife Service basically has to do now if a species is listed as threatened. However, they can't if it's listed as endangered. The monarch, Chris has told me, would most likely be listed as threatened, but there is always the chance that there could be like a catastrophic weather event that wipes out a huge number of them, say while they're in the wintering over area in Mexico, and they could go right to endangered. Then there'd be no 4D rule. But that rule, anybody who deals with northern long-eared bat, that rule can say things like, that you can do road maintenance work within so many feet of the road at this time of year. They put limits in there, but it does provide take authorization with this sort of if this then that setup. The other sort of benefit of a CCAA is it provides immediate benefits to the monarch that could also help delay or even preclude the need for listing. So in general, that's what a CCAA is. It could be done for any species. The one that was developed for the monarch and specific to energy and transportation lands is there's a document you can download that it's about 90 pages for the core document itself, and then the rest is appendices and reference lists. Note that it was prepared for a group called the Energy Resources Center at University of Illinois, Chicago. That's the permit holder. I think on this next slide, I have a schematic showing that anybody who decides to enroll in the Monarch CCAA as a partner, you would be interfacing with the University of Illinois, Chicago in their consultant Cardno, not really directly with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And again, this particular CCAA is specific to transportation and energy infrastructure and right-of-way that could be owned, leased, or easement. And that kind of comes into play in a few minutes when you look at what areas you might want to include. A couple key terms and how the CCAA works in this case is there's enrolled acres. That's the areas that you want to enroll where you want coverage for take. For most applicants, that would be the road right-of-way plus your supporting facilities such as gravel pits, maintenance facilities. And a subset of that is called the adopted acres, which for counties, the minimum amount, unless you get a variance that you have to prove certain things to get, the minimum amount is 5%. And it's quite a bit higher than that for like energy transmission lines and even the state DOT. So we got 5% assigned as the adopted acres requirement. And as noted here, that the location of your adopted acres can vary year to year. You don't have to use the same areas. You can, but you don't have to. And then within the adopted acres, you'll have monitoring sites that are randomly selected. Another key term is conservation measures. And note that those can include existing or new practices. So what that means is that for some counties, depending on how you manage your right-of-ways, you might be able to enroll without making a whole lot of changes. And for others, it could require a lot of change. And then this slide just shows some examples of the type of conservation measures creating better habitat, for example, by using more native flowering plants and milkweed in seed mixes when you're revegetating construction sites. Planning to time your mowing or herbicide for when caterpillars and monarchs are not present at all, and or using targeted pesticide application to try to avoid impacting the monarch as opposed to broadcast. And another one that you'll see St. Louis County talk about is set aside, just allowing certain areas to remain in a natural state with limited management. And keep in mind the requirement, this only applies to 5% of the enrolled area. Monitoring is required. My take on this, having watched some presentations and things and talked to Chris, is that this is probably the least difficult part of it. Watch me eat my words on this at some point in a year or two, but yeah, for most counties, it'll be 10 sites randomly selected, 1,500, so 150 by 10 feet in size. You walk through and you look for milkweed, count the stems and see if you have at least 6 or more stems of milkweed. That's the absolute minimum. You have the option to identify other plants and things like that and go beyond that if you want, but that's the minimum. And Chris has said it really hasn't taken MnDOT staff much time, maybe 15 minutes per site. If you have to do monitoring, that does bring up the question, what if monitoring does not find enough milkweed? What do we do then? Is that non-compliance or something? And I decided to put an actual quote in from the CCAA here that is not achieving the milkweed or nectar plant targets in monitoring does not result in non-compliance. Your certificate of inclusion cannot be revoked simply because monitoring targets aren't achieved. And they go on to say that planting milkweed is not a required conservation measure or expected to be required adaptive management if targets aren't met. So it gets into more detail on what happens, but it doesn't seem like that didn't strike me as being a big concern. And just wrapping up this part, the best place to find more information on the Monarch CCAA is at this website. The earlier emails, at least one or both of the emails that Jody would have sent out on behalf of the committee should have had links to this, but we can send it out again. That's where you find the actual Monarch CCAA, and the toolkit has all sorts of case studies, guidance documents, the cost benefit analysis, just a lot of really useful information, and the application materials are there. So that's very important website. And just in case some people joined late, I thought I'd repeat the agenda, the webinar agenda, in case so you can all see where we're at. This is the end of section 1 and means we will transition 2 minutes early into part 2, the presentation by a variety of counties. So I should be handing it over to Sean at Stearns County. And let me know if there's a problem with the sound echoing if I'm not muting at my end, because I'm not sure if I mute, if I can unmute again. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Sean West from Stearns County. I'm their environmental technician. And we're just going to kind of go through sort of our process in deciding how we wanted to approach the CCAA and sort of what decisions we made along the way. Hopefully this will help you out if you do plan on enrolling into the CCAA. First off, we had to decide how and what to include in the enrolled area. So enrollment of the entire Stearns County highway system and related maintenance facilities. This we have variable width, right-of-way width for our county highway system. So we went with an average of 50 feet from center line, so 100 feet total. And we multiply that times the amount of center line miles of county roadways. And then we also included our handful of maintenance facilities. And you just had to add in the acreage for those parcels. We decided not to include the center 36 of impervious surface. Not all of our roadways are 36 feet, but that number just worked as a good average. We decided at the county that there's not that much risk of having milkweed growing in that center 36 feet. We don't usually have projects that linger on 2-3 years where we have exposed surfaces like that would be in that sort of area. So in the end of all this, our total acreage ended up being 7,572 acres. Next slide. So after that process, we had to determine sort of what factors, determining what factors and choosing what acreage to apply conservation measures to. This would be your adopted acres, and that would be that 5%. We mostly wanted to choose roadways with the largest right-of-way width to sort of get our biggest bang for the buck. We solicited early input from our maintenance operations supervisors, and this really allowed us to see where we would have potential conflicts with land users, where we had established milkweed populations already, and really where we might be applying some of these conservation measures already. I mean, the end of this is just choosing the right of way that would be the least amount of work to comply with the CCAA. We wanted to choose entire sections of highway. This would hopefully reduce conflict and arguments between landowners, and it really simplifies, the training of maintenance staff or new maintenance staff. So we'd have potentially less, kind of screw ups in the future. And I did consult with our ag inspector regarding invasive plants before choosing the 5% of adopted acres. And we really just wanted to avoid areas that would be concerned where we now would be, say, broadcast herbicide spraying, where in the future we would have to do spot spraying. This is kind of just a map to show kind of what areas we chose, what highways we chose. In the CCAA, you're allowed to phase out your implementation plan over 5 years. And so this map kind of shows what our different phases are and how we're approaching our CCAA application. You can go to the next slide. So what we planned on using for conservation measures, most of our road ditches contain populations of milkweed already. I'm sure several counties in central Minnesota, southern Minnesota are kind of in the same boat. And so the biggest conservation measure for us would be deferred mowing during peak monarch activity. This would be prior to May 15th. There is a small window where monarch activity sort of dwindles in the middle of summer from June 30th to July 5th. And then post September 20th. We mainly do broadcast herbicide application right now. So on this 5% of adopted acres, we would be moving to a more targeted spot spraying approach. Brush clearing, which is not a major conservation measure for us because most of our right-of-ways are already cleared of brush. We do have some issues with like sumac that tends to take over relatively quickly. And then if we have the opportunity, we plan on overseeding with some Mesic Prairie seed mix as well. And we plan on using this mix on future reconstruct projects to sort of get ahead of the game as far as establishing milkweed populations. So while we're at it, opportunities, like I said in the previous slide, we have a few future reconstruct projects where we will be incorporating seed mixes that contain milkweed seed to get ahead of the game. We intend on using these post-reconstruction right-of-way areas as backup if we have issues with the original chosen sections of right-of-way, which is a big point because the CCAA does allow for a lot of flexibility in sort of how or where you establish this 5% of adopted acres. This slide just shows a quick summation of our kind of cost analysis of what it's going to cost us for our size of county and our amount of roadways. Really, it's relatively inexpensive as compared to, say, having to develop an HCP or suffering some, disruptance to maintenance operations or, your near future construction activities. You
And
go to
just-
the next.
Okay, I thought I might just point out this partner fee calculator is very easy to use. It's one other thing that's on the toolkit. Once you've estimated your enrolled acres and your target adoption acres, you just answer a few questions in, I don't know, 10 minutes or less, don't you think, Sean? It gives you your initial fees and your annual fees.
Yeah, and there is a separate tab on this spreadsheet where it explains how to achieve. There are some discounts for, say, if you're at 10% over what's required to enroll. The initial step is a 10% discount at 10% over that, and you also receive some discounts for adding some extra things to, say, when you're out doing your annual inspections of these sites. You can count milkweed stems, take notes on additional plants, that sort of thing.
Yep. And just the annual fee to get a rough range. You said you guys have, I think you said 7,000 or 8,000 enrolled acres. Ours is a little more than 2.5 times that, and our annual fee is close to 8,000, which would be the most in the state. So I'm guessing Stearns might be pretty typical on that. So.
Yep.
Anything else, Sean, from you guys?
I think that's it.
All right, and I'd like to think Sean was always the quickest on following up on committee things, and he filled out his application, looked at MnDOT's, did his, and I used his as inspiration for ours, so that was helpful. Olmsted County, I don't know if Chad or Kay is doing yours.
Yeah, thank you, Carol. This is Chad Schumann, Olmsted County Highway Maintenance Engineer. And when I was invited to participate in this program here, it was one of the first concerns I had was, well, how do we manage this when we have all of the wild parsnip and other noxious weeds in the right of ways, and how does that change how we're doing things? So there's a lot of different areas in Minnesota that have noxious weeds, but in southeast Minnesota especially, we have the wild parsnip among others, and it's hard enough to control it without any other limitations. And I think the CCAA conservation measures do present some other challenges for us. Now, the different, it's kind of mentioned earlier that Carol had mentioned, the CEA recommended conservation measures, include the brush removal. And that's basically just to increase the different, the areas that can contain forbs and milkweed. Seeding milkweed and set-asides, kind of the same concept, is just ways to promote more habitat. When it comes to the conservation mowing, though, this is different than what we would do in the past, and it presents some limitations on when you can actually do your mowing, and it suggests that you don't do any mowing until after September 20th. There's a few other times in there that you can mow, but for the practical purposes, it's after September 20th. And haying pretty much goes along with mowing. It's pretty hard to hay if this is in a conservation area. And then finally, they recommend targeted herbicide treatment. So basically, when it comes to what we've been doing in these areas to control the wild parsnip, we found that the most cost-effective ways is to, for treating the noxious weeds, is basically mowing the wild parsnip before it goes to head, or it's just basically spraying broadcast herbicides in order to kill it so that it doesn't spread. And like I say, both of these are in stark contrast to any sort of accepted conservation measures of the CCAA. So what can we do? It's important to note that the CEAA does allow some flexibility in how to deal with different situations. So nothing is really just black and white. And also, as Sean discussed or whatever, we have enrolled areas and we have the adopted areas. Nothing really has to change in the enrolled areas based on the CCAA, but the conservation measures really only apply to the adopted areas, which are only 5% of the enrolled areas. So I think the first thing we need to do if we want to address it and follow the CCAA is to really make management a priority. We have a lot of different conflicting priorities, and in order to be successful, management of the adopted areas will have to be a priority, because it just doesn't take that long for the wild parsnip to infest, large areas and spread really fast. And just like Sean mentioned or whatever about, adopted areas, it's best to choose adopted areas that are going to be easy to manage. Now, when it comes to the actual parsnip, one thing you can do is you can pull it out by hand. I've watched our parks people do it. but there's a reason why it's a noxious weed. You know, I guess we haven't done a whole lot of pulling that ourselves. The best way for us to control it has always been, you know, the broadcast spraying. But with the CEA measures, I mean, really what we got to do is we got to do target spraying or hand spraying and only taking out the parsnip. It takes a lot of time, but the thing is it's not gonna kill the forbs. When it comes to mowing, we used to, you know, mow out all of our ditches, and we just have to make sure that we're cognizant of the timing of that, you know, so that if we're going to mow it out, we have to wait until after September 20th to be in compliance with the conservation measures. I guess one other thing that should be brought up though is just native species. There's a lot of research that's still going on in this, but I think, you know, by planting native species in the ditches, the natives kind of basically take over, and the wild parsnip can't compete with them. And so it's hard to get them established in the first place. But once you get them established, then there really isn't as much concern or as much risk for the wild parsnip, you know, basically taking over. And so that's always an option too that we're going to start looking further into. So basically, in conclusion, I guess, while it's already a challenge to manage noxious weeds, the CEAA will make it more difficult. It's only in the 5% adopted areas, and we think that there are ways that we can actually, you know, manage this so that we can stay in compliance with the CEAA.
All right. Thanks, Chad.
Yes.
Another plug for native plants unrelated to habitat is that they have very deep roots, especially the prairie species. So I always look at that as like injecting rebar into your side slopes. Reduce runoff. Oh, I'm next. Okay, St. Louis County, back to us. This is Carol Andrews, St. Louis County. We took a fairly simplified approach to calculating our enrolled acres. Just used a spreadsheet that we'll probably post on the website, where we divided our roads just into two types. The CSAs, we took that distance times 75 feet of right-of-way average, and then the remaining county roads and unorganized township roads that we are responsible for, we did 66-foot total right-of-way width. And in our case, whereas Sean and Stearns, they did 36 feet, we just have a lot of really narrow roads. We only subtracted 24 feet average width of quote-unquote pavement, where pavement could equal the gravel as well. So that totaled little 16,500 acres of road right-of-way. We added to that maintenance facilities. So we had to look at each of those, add that acreage up, and gravel pits. We own quite a bit of gravel pits. So that added another 1,000-some acres, totaling just under 18,000 acres times 5%, 886 adopted acres. So that's the calculation method we used. And if you're filling out the application, there actually is a sort of similar spreadsheet in the application. We did our own just so we could better keep track of the approach we were taking with the two different right-of-way widths. I'm going to jump into conservation measures. And like I said, it can be an existing practice. In St. Louis County, this picture should show what a lot of our roads look like. This is one happens to be near Floodwood, if you're familiar with the area, but our right-of-ways often include just the safety mow, the first 5-8 feet alongside the road, and the rest of it can remain untouched for years and years and years. So set aside is something that we already do. That being said, we would like our right-of-ways to have a greater clear zone that is free of woody debris or woody trees and so on, like the one shown on the right, which has a nice wide right-of-way, but that's because it's underneath the power line. In this same area last fall, we hired loggers to remove trees within, I can't remember, I think the 33 feet, I guess, from the center line. And so that's something, it's costly. We can only do so many miles per year, but that is something we will count as a conservation measure, that clearing the trees, in addition to the safety improvements associated with less shading and, you know, tree impacts for road departure, also will create that grassland prairie area that's good for monarchs. So it's sort of a while we're at it. We have not used a lot of herbicide in the last 20 years. Prior to that, there was quite a bit more use. There was public pushback and it was stopped. We do plan to try to use targeted herbicide. We do a little bit for invasive species, but also for controlling brush regrowth. And from what I can tell from reading the CCAA, that is allowed. And again, it helps maintain the open appearance. I just took a screenshot from one page of the application to give you a rough idea of what this part looks like, where it lists the different conservation measures. And again, there's the column that says pre-agreement practice and post-agreement practice, where there's not a requirement that you are upping your game from none to routine on everything. I think they just want to get a picture of what are you doing now and what, if anything, are you going to do differently in the future. And in our case, like I said, a large amount of ours will be achieved by set-asides by areas that we don't mow. And once they're cleared, we'll probably do a rotational mowing where every 3 years we do a full right-of-way mow to try to keep the woody stuff from regrowing. But yeah, so they'll stay about the same. We do want to step up our use of seeding and planting native seed mixes. We've been increasing that at some sites, just trying to make it more routine. Keep in mind, this is a draft application, not approved, so you can't apply and say that this is what St. Louis County got approved yet. I wanted to point out that there's several different types of milkweeds that grow in Minnesota. I shouldn't say several, I think 4 maybe. The frequency that they're found at, my understanding is that they're quite common outside of northern Minnesota, especially at least northeastern Minnesota. The slide in the mid, or the picture in the middle, is the only milkweed I found in early October driving 50 miles of St. Louis County roads. And it was under a power line, so the power company can claim it. So we don't have a lot of milkweed up here, but my point is the different conservation measures will vary obviously by land use and geography. So I asked Kandiyohi County last Friday if they would also share their experience. I think Mel hopefully is on the line. I found out that Kandiyohi County had applied for coverage when I asked the UIC if they could go ahead and if they had any examples from county governments, and they said talk to Kandiyohi. So Angelica or Mel, do you guys want to take over?
Yeah, we're on. Both of us are here. This is Mel Odens, Kandiyohi County. And as you can see, we've only got one slide. So this might be a little bit brief and maybe justifiably so, because a lot of the stuff you've talked about so far is nothing different than what we looked at. We did our application kind of our process and I would say in 3 different steps. First of all, when this came out, we were concerned because, you know, more work, more control, more cost, and limited like road and bridge budgets already. But we did an internal review in our maintenance department, and just because like maybe we do a lot of this already, and what we found out is, number one, we do a lot of the spraying, the spot spraying, the noxious weed control, the mowing. And so we, you know, the guys, if you will, in the maintenance department thought, well, if this is something that will avoid delay, we'll just step up and do it, because it's not a lot different than what we're doing. We've got a lot of young people that are eager to do spot spraying and spot mowing and tree removal and woody vegetation. So for us, it was good to hear. We have about 650 miles of road in our county. And so what we made the decision is to do very similar to what we've heard before. When you include all your roadways, you've got your effective roadway, and then you've also, you know, and so we have varying widths. We use 50 foot from center line each way. And we have some that are more. So we use an average of the 50 footer. Actually, the effective amount would be about 54 feet, 27 on each side. We selected roads that are very low mowed, if you will, or not mowed very often, or very seldom mowed. We're up in the lakes, or we have a lot of lakes in the northern part of the county that are very conducive to the milkweed, and we have milkweeds up there ready. So it actually that part of it worked pretty well. So then we did step number 2, where we went to the county board with this concept of more species being listed, or control, or one more application to fill out to get a construction project going. And then, but with it came a fee. And so we were a little concerned about, getting the elected officials' support. But when we talked about it at the county board, they were more concerned about not delaying construction, or delaying maintenance, or delaying improvements. And so they were actually flipped it and wanted to use it as a kind of a PR thing, where we could actually help the loss, if you will, of one of the butterfly, or the pollinators, which is kind of a buzz thing. And we have a lot of vacation people up here that like to, vacation and see nature. So they actually flipped it into something that they wanted us to pursue. So the third step we did is we went out to the public. And when we went to the public, we thought, here we go. We're going to expose this thing, and we're going to see how it goes. I was shocked, because we're getting all kinds of positive response. In fact, I think we've only had maybe one person that didn't like it, which maybe we kind of expected that. But from there, it's been random phone calls every week ever since we sent out the letter in November. Yeah, November. Just had another one last week about people that want to give talks. They want to. So for us, we did it in 3 steps. We included all our roads. The county board was on board with us pursuing it. The public is very on board, but I would also agree that I don't think the roadways is going to be the final solution. So we're going to phase this in by doing roadways, but I can see us phasing it in with incorporating the public-private partnership concept with the ag community. So that's kind of where we are. If I'm here for questions, if you've got any.
Thanks, Mel. That's really interesting. Did you send, when you mentioned letters, did those go to homeowners on the adopted acre roads? I'm just curious on that.
Yeah, yes, we sent the letters to all the adopted acres, but our newspapers, our media covered it really well here. And I don't know if they covered it because they liked it, or they covered it because they just wanted to get it out there. But we were a little concerned here locally at first, because we thought, well, we don't really need to invite all this trouble. But actually it turned into being like this secret that people really wanted us to do. So actually we feel pretty good about it here, but we'll see if our application gets approved.
All right, great. Well, thanks again, you guys, for jumping in sort of last minute. That was useful. So this is the start of part 3. And I forgot to mention earlier that I think it's going to work best if we get through our presentation and then open it up to Q&A, in part because I can't see anything other than the presentation. I'm going to need to be able to see the chat box. If there's something super urgent, I think Sean is trying to watch if the chat or whatever you call it in go-to meetings for any concerns. But otherwise, if you want to start putting questions in there, that's fine too. I think this last part will take about 10 to 15 minutes. So becoming a Monarch CCAA partner or not, what are the risks, benefits, and costs? I think we've kind of hammered on this already, but every county needs to decide this for themselves, because this is a voluntary voluntary agreement. So are you going to become a partner? If yes, when? Are you going to do it just your county, or do you want to partner with other counties? I have a slide on that. If not, do you have a sort of a backup plan? And if you are going forward with it, the county engineers like Mel and everybody mentioned, budgets are tight. How is this going to affect my staff time, both to get enrolled, but then as we implement, will there be costs associated with it? Primary benefit is regulatory predictability that you can kind of look at as an insurance policy against risk of project delays and interrupted maintenance activities. And I know the other day Chad was pointing out that the interrupted maintenance activities, one of his biggest concerns. It's just something that we just need to be able to keep implementing that for safety of the roads. The ability, here's another benefit though, is say your conservation measures might impact, I don't know, a seed mix or something that affects what you put into your project designs, specials, things like that. It's nice to know ahead of time versus at the tail end of a project review by MnDOT where they have to go back and change your plans or things like that. Just knowing ahead of time helps. And then secondary benefit I have listed as good PR. So thanks, Mel, for saying that that is in fact what happened with Kandiyohi County. I did not know that when I made this slide. We'll hope for that in our county. And also the potential to merge Monarch conservation measures with actions we want to take already. Like I mentioned, the better maintaining of the clear zones. Risks of not enrolling are really this is kind of two sides of the same coin. If you don't enroll, that is an option. What you'd be looking at for non-federal projects is you'd have to get that take authorization in another way, such as through a habitat conservation plan. That is another tool, but the timing is often those are done closer to the period to when the species is listed, so you could have a gap versus the CCAA that lets you get ahead of the listing. And I think I talked about the 4D rule enough earlier that may or may not cover the activities that you need take coverage for. Federal projects, that's federal due to funding, Army Corps permit, National Forest land, whatever. Those reviews under NEPA that go through MnDOT will take longer and could result in case-by-case conservation measures. So it gets back to that, you won't know until the review comes back what those measures are. They could change over time, so you lose that predictability. They could end up triggering a formal consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service, which means MnDOT sends it to U.S. Fish and Wildlife. That typically adds 6 months, but could easily envision that the Fish and Wildlife Service would be overwhelmed by those if the Monarch gets listed. So that's for projects, construction projects. Maintenance, you run the risk of mowing and other activities like ditch cleaning that constitute taking, not being able to do that without getting approvals in some other way. And here's an example that Chris had mentioned to the committee early on that Jim and I found, like, I don't know, motivational or useful. There's a beautiful small butterfly called the Karner blue butterfly that's found in couple areas of Wisconsin that was listed in 1992 as endangered. And our understanding and what Chris learned from a coworker at Wisconsin DOT was that it took 7 years to develop the habitat conservation plan needed to cover take for that. And that was after, no, that didn't start until after the listing. So if people wait again to do that for the Monarch, I'm afraid there could be this huge backlog. The cost to prepare a habitat conservation plan, I found this just this morning in my notes from the meeting, Chris had said could be roughly, very roughly $200,000 or more. And one of the notes from the woman at Wisconsin DOT was that what she heard was this halted mowing operations for a year. So this is some of the conversation that made us as a committee early on go, yeah, this seems like what we need to do is get coverage under the CCAA. There are drawbacks to enrolling, and this is where it gets complicated, so I hand it back to Chris.
Sure, thanks. So As you can see here on the slide, the CCAA itself is considered a federal undertaking. So it's a federal agreement with Fish and Wildlife Service. And so it triggers, all the different rules and regulations that come along with the federal undertaking. And so the CCAA itself has a NEPA document already that covers the entire agreement. But it also, includes considerations for Section 106 under the National Historic Preservation Act. It covers Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, which we'll talk about on the next slide. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. Fish and Wildlife has worked really hard to try to make these, kind of associated regulations as painless as possible. And so, I think it's important to be aware that it kind of triggers this, these different regulations, but I wouldn't let this, really drive your decision as to whether or not you want to learn more. And if, after discussing some of the other pros and cons, you want to start to dig into the details, I think we might have another webinar later that would get into the weeds of this, but it can ultimately factor into your decision. It's important to note, and on this slide here, one of the big changes is that plants, for example, federally listed plants, are only protected on federal lands or during federal activities. And so currently, as a county or city road manager, if you have federal plants on your roadside, they receive no special protection. That's not the case for animals. And so from an animal standpoint, joining the CCAA shouldn't add a lot of issues. That said, the majority of counties do not have federal plants. And those that do, thank you, those that do, a lot of them do not occur on roadsides. There's really only 2 species that occur on roadsides of these 4 species, and that's the prairie bush clover and the western prairie fringe orchid. And you can see here, it's a relatively small number of counties that have those species. And, we didn't get in the details here, but again, many of those populations don't occur on roadsides. So even if you see your county listed here, there is a chance that it wouldn't impact things on your end. But for those counties that do have federal plants in your roadside, there's a little bit of a change there. But again, don't want to get into all the weeds, and we can discuss, these aspects of things in a lot more detail when we get to that point.
Thanks, Chris. I think 2 more slides for me, and then Sean's going to talk for a minute about his thoughts on when to apply if you decide to. Costs. The initial legwork to understand the CCAA, estimate your enrolled acres, and select your conservation measures, plus prepare the application. Roughly 200 hours, give or take 100 hours probably, is the ballpark that we feel like you'd be looking at. Sean was able to look at how much time he's put into it. Preparing the application itself really only takes about 40 hours. I have talked to one consulting firm who I know is, I think, doing this work for at least 2 or 3 Minnesota counties. It's maybe more than that now. My opinion, that's a reasonable way to go as an option. Another option I'll show in a second is to form groups of 2 or more counties. There's pros and cons to that, so that you get that initial legwork of those costs, fees paid to by the partners to cover the cost of the permit holder, and that's explained in the CCAA and associated documents. There's an application fee and an annual fee. And then staff time for implementation. As you've heard from the presentations, for some counties it doesn't require much of a change from existing efforts, and others it is. So that's going to be very variable. There is an implementation plan due within, I think it's a year of getting approval, but that is not meant to be a big document. The template is only 3 pages. And then staff time for monitoring, as I mentioned, what Chris's comment was for MnDOT, it was mostly the travel time. Of course, they cover the whole state. So that shouldn't be real significant, and there is some degree of annual report monitoring required. Working together as a group of counties, this is just my 2 cents on it, is you could probably pool resources to hire a consultant. There would be the reduced cost of just the one application fee. The annual fees are based on number of enrolled acres, so it's not going to save you a huge amount there. Oh, and I made a note. I asked Iris with the UIC, and she did not know of any groups doing this yet, but said it is allowed. The downsides, as I see it, is it's hard enough to coordinate within our county, so doing that between 2 counties might be tricky. And if one county doesn't hold up their end of the deal, you know, that could cause a problem. But if there's 2 or more counties that are used to doing a lot of work together, it might be something that helps, that you find of use. Chris mentioned that MnDOT's been asked, could they just incorporate counties into the MnDOT's application and coverage? And he said technically it's possible, but counties would have to give jurisdictional control to MnDOT, which neither the counties or MnDOT want. So I think the answer is no, in so many words on that. Sean, do you have comments on when to submit the application?
Right. So just to reiterate what Chris had mentioned earlier in the presentation, the listing decision by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is warranted but precluded. They determined that the butterfly meets the definition of a threatened or endangered species but lacks resources to take further action at this time, or is precluded by other high priority species. The decision will likely be challenged by monarch conservation groups. As of now, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service anticipates listing the monarch making a rule to the listing in 2024 if it's still warranted. So the service will evaluate the need for listing on an annual basis until a listing rule is published or not warranted finding is made. The speed at which backlog listed species is dealt with depends on the current political administration and federal litigation. So this could mean an expedited decision regarding the monarch listing rule. Next slide. So what are we looking for? Litigation in federal court could expedite the monarch rule listing. And there's a few scenarios that could happen depending on the court ruling. They could instantly list the monarch via court ruling, which would go into effect instantly or within 30 to 60 days. And this would really be the biggest risk if you had not applied already, which could result in a gap in coverage between the time you submit your application, if you have an application ready, or you could miss the deadline. Direct the listing decision back to the Fish and Wildlife Service and set a deadline for Fish and Wildlife Service reevaluation ahead of its fiscal year 24 schedule, which would move the decision forward. They could rule in favor of the service, which would mean just there's no change. It's just is what it is right now, and then they would look at it again here in fiscal year 24. Or all parties could settle, which often sets an accelerated listing decision, which can move that the 2024 date up. You can go to the next slide.
And one thing that I'm not sure if we've emphasized is that the CCAA, you can only be a partner until it gets listed. You have to have a complete application at least I think, before it gets listed. You can't wait for it to be listed and then apply.
There is some things that could change that outside of a court ruling, which would, if there's a significant change to the monarch population, so changes to the monarch population, negative or positive, could have an impact on the timeline on when a decision is made. And this is because the Fish and Wildlife Service will look at it on an annual basis. And while they're looking at it, they're accumulating more data. And so the scenario was given earlier, if there's a massive storm and it kills off a large portion of the population, well, that would probably move it up to a higher priority. And with the current administration, political administration, I should say, they could make significant progress on the backlog species. So this really depends on the focus of the current administration and the allocation of resources they want to apply to it. So yeah. So when should you submit the CCAA application? As of now, there is not a specific deadline to submit the CCAA application. If your county is planning on enrolling in the CCAA, it will be important to develop a plan and have an application ready for submittal. So you really want to be in a position to submit the application. This includes sort of starting that thought process if you haven't, on what you want to enroll in the plan, what you want to consider for adopted acreage, where you apply those conservation measures. The Monarch listing date could and will likely be determined by federal court litigation. So the CCA first considers applicants with larger enrolled acreage. So really, if you can imagine the hypothetical of a court ruling to instantly list the Monarch, the number of entities, counties, private utilities, etc., applying for coverage all at the same time would create a rather large backlog of application reviews. And so this could potentially create a gap in the CCA coverage between the listing date and the date in which your application is accepted. So this could have a major impact on sort of your maintenance operations and near future construction projects. Really, our plan at Stearns County is to have the CCA application, near that 90% finished mark or completed. We really already decided as a county what to include in our enrolled areas and what roadways to apply our conservation measures to. We've had several internal discussions with our maintenance operations to continue work proactively towards applying some of the conservation measures already, if we're not applying them, right now. This is just a hope that, when we do submit the application and we do submit the implementation plan, we sort of have the smoothest transition as possible into being compliant with the CCAA.
All right. Thank you very much, Sean, for going over that. And that is not an easy question to answer. So you did a great job. All right. I asked my boss, Jim, to bat cleanup here before we get into Q&A. I'm going to pass it over to Jim.
All right. So this is a little Carol humor here, that we have to put up with on a daily basis. But we'll go back. It's a good picture. So this is on Lake Nipigon up in Canada, and yes, I would rather be fishing right now instead of talking about threatened and endangered species, but here we are, and the pike says, yeah, he'd rather be swimming, and hopefully he still is because he went back in the lake. So next slide. So and some of the stuff that I'm going to say, I think Carol and others have covered really well. So I'll kind of get through this quickly, but one of the things that I would really encourage all of the counties listening today to do is please use this work that has been done by the subcommittee. They put a lot of time into it, done a deep dive, and don't feel you need to recreate the wheel. So once this stuff does get put up on the state aid website, and thank you, state aid, for hosting this information. Once that is up there, please take advantage of it. It will help you greatly, or make the phone calls to those folks who are further along in the process. It'll save you a lot of time. There's no need for all of us to reinvent the wheel every time 87 times. And again, the reasoning for picking the different counties on the subcommittee was to try to capture the different situations across the state in the various regions of the state, running from the northeast, heavy forested area down to the farm areas. So take advantage of that. Again, as you've seen throughout this presentation, the alternatives to the CCAA are really not good or practical. The thought of evaluating on a project-by-project basis, or every maintenance operation you undertake, and evaluating it for take of the species is totally impractical. That will not be possible. Entering into an HCP or habitat conservation plan, as you saw with the Karner blue butterfly example, could possibly take years, and hundreds of thousands of dollars to develop. If we had lots of agencies going through that process, it could even take longer. So that does not seem like a viable option either, or a cost-effective one. And then obviously it would create significant delays to try to go through either of those processes on a regular basis or on a one-time basis with the HCP. And when we talk about delay costs, there's of course normal inflationary costs on an annual basis. And when you're talking about projects that are and programs that are millions or tens of millions of dollars, you very quickly eclipse the cost of complying with the CCAA. Also, if you're ceasing operations like mowing or other types of things, there's a reduced safety across our highway network as well. So it really seems like a no-brainer that if the Monarch is listed, the CCAA is the way to go. This is a quick snapshot of what the costs look like for St. Louis County. Initial legwork, we have around $15,000. I would say that's multiple staff across maintenance, Carol's work, other folks' work. Just those are internalized costs. Trying to keep track of time put into that set of work. We also are looking at the application fee. We're a large county, a lot of acres, around $3,000 for the application fee, and also about 10 grand in startup implementation. So about 28,000 in one-time costs. And then as far as the ongoing costs themselves, we're looking at for our county about $8,000 per year for the fee, ongoing fee at 886 acres. Most counties will be a lot smaller than that, probably about half. Staff time, about $1,000 a year, and the annual report, about $1,000 a year. So, as compared to our whole budget and as compared to looking at those other options on the previous slide and those impacts, this far and away is the less expensive option. We do have concerns about Section 106 and Section 7, and as we work with Chris and get our arms around that and get more comfortable with that, I'm sure we can, get past that hurdle as well. But that's something that, we at St. Louis County at least still have in the back of our mind. How is that going to impact our projects and operations? But I'm sure we can get over that hurdle. So make lemonade out of your lemons. We believe that our conservation measure that we're going to use the most will be to not do mowing in certain areas, so we're all good at not doing things or procrastination, right? So that's something that we'll obviously employ. And actually, in some cases, for some counties, obviously, if you're mowing all the time on all your rights of way, or even multiple times a year, you actually could achieve a cost savings there, or at least internally opportunity costs where you can use those personnel and equipment hours somewhere else doing something else on your system. So looking at it from the positive side. You can also use the CCA as an opportunity to fund an activity you haven't been able to do before. In our case, we are looking at doing more logging and brushing and opening up our rights of way and counting that as an effective conservation measure. It's actually one where we think we can make a positive difference for the Monarch. And then finally, and Mel really covered it well in his discussion, in our case, we have not been doing herbicide spraying for many, many years. We used to have a fairly robust program until we kind of ran into political issues with that. But now we are definitely going to use the slogan of we are going to introduce herbicide spraying back into the fold to help the endangered monarch butterfly. And that's a message that we want to use and use from a PR perspective as well, just like Mel had mentioned. And really, yeah, there's a fair amount to get your arms around here, but don't panic. You know, we can plan our way through this like we do everything else. And, you know, hopefully working together, we can all manage this and learn from each other and come out with a good product in the end. So that's all I had, Carol.
Thank you, Jim. And this is the last slide I have before Q&A, and just sort of action items, mostly things we've mentioned. You know, look up, get used to using the right-of-way website. If you have insomnia, read it, but at least glance through it. Start looking at calculating enrolled areas and adopted areas if you're leaning towards applying, and conservation measures, and see if you can make a go, no-go decision, and perhaps start at least filling out the application form. Like Jim said, work on it as you have time. Maybe it's next winter, maybe it's this summer. As appropriate, touch base with your county board, and also let the committee know if there's topics besides Section 7 and 106 compliance that it would be useful to put on the agenda, for webinar 3. And then the state aid website, I have the link there, and I can send this out in an email. So with that, I am going to end the slideshow and try to see if we have folks that have posted questions or want to speak up. See if I can do this without hanging up. Let's see, chat, show conversation. So, Chris has been answering questions in the chat. All right.
That looks Carol, we might read them, and I can certainly respond verbally. That way, if folks aren't able to look at the chat, they can see what the questions were and what the response was. Do you want me to do that real quick?
Yeah, I have it open now too. So the one question that Joe Wilson posted, how do we restrict haying by farmers on enrolled acres? Good question. And I see, Chris, you said haying would only need to be restricted on the adopted acres, so the other 95% of the roadside can continue to be hayed as they are currently. Do any of the, I'm gonna call it panelists or committee members, have other thoughts on that? Haying's not commonly a problem on our right-of-way. And I think, Sean, you guys did send letters, but anybody else?
Yeah, Carol, I would just add a bit to that. So I know, the haying discussion has been a big one for MnDOT. And one of the ways that we're kind of pitching the CCAA as being beneficial, not only to our agency, but also those other third parties that utilize our right of way, is that, again, some of the things that are restricted are on that subset of adopted acres. And so by joining this agreement, we are, allowing third parties to continue using our roadsides that are not part of those adopted acres, essentially how they've always been using them. And so in many ways, haying, if the Monarch gets listed, haying will be easier to allow than it would be if you weren't part of the CCAA. And certainly Fish and Wildlife Service has some discretion over enforcement and when they take an enforcement action. But, technically speaking, if the Monarch got listed and there wasn't a 4D rule exempting haying, then, the person doing the haying could get in trouble. And if the county is allowing the haying to occur, there's some liability there as well. And so, like I said, this is really, it allows for haying to continue without risking, some sort of regulatory action by the federal agency. And so kind of another way to think about it.
Thanks. That's a good one. I need to add to the FAQs, I think. What about public drainage buffers? Joe also asked if there's been consideration to enrolling public drainage buffers to allow county to be compliant. So I think as it would be like a good habitat area, so as adopted acres. enrolled and adopted acres. Chris, do you want to answer that one too?
Sure. And so this has come up on some of our calls. And as I noted, the CCAA is applicable to lands that have a transportation or energy purpose. And when we discussed this question with Fish and Wildlife and UIC in the past, with the possible exception of, a county ditch system that, directly parallels a county road, other county ditch systems would not qualify under that transportation or energy purpose. And so in most cases would not qualify.
That's the question of most of the counties, either the Public Works Department or other entities, are responsible for maintaining ditches, which usually includes work during the Monarch season. Any comments on how we will do that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the short answer is if monarchs get listed, the counties may have other, regulatory needs. County parks come to mind. A lot of counties manage county green space. And so, those, entities may need to develop a regulatory mechanism that could then apply to a county ditch system. There's a couple other ways it could go. As I mentioned earlier, Fish and Wildlife is working very closely with agriculture. And so it's possible that the agricultural agreement, whether it's a CCAA or some other mechanism, might allow for those county ditch systems to be covered because they largely occur within that agricultural landscape. Another option would be, maybe a future amendment to the Monarch CCAA, whether it's a transportation one or some other, CCAA, they might pop up. Maybe we could get that covered. And then I think, kind of as I see it off the top of my head, last but certainly not least, I think, counties would be in a pretty good position if they were enrolled in the CCAA for their roadsides to advocate strongly for a 4D rule that, might exempt some of those other managed lands from the take prohibition at that time. So when assuming the Monarch does get proposed for listing and they promulgate a 4D rule, that all goes through a significant amount of public comment. And I know it's been discussed quite a bit in the CCAA kind of working group that, if it does get listed and if a 4D rule is promulgated, which it would almost certainly would be, the group that has kind of, push forward this Monarch CCAA would probably try to use that, the leverage we've gained by this, nice public-private partnership to get some terms clearly articulated in a 4D rule that provides us, transportation and energy organizations some added benefit.
You're saying, Chris,
So I don't know.
Can't submit the application and implement it and forget about this. We're going to have to keep an eye on it.
Yeah, but I would just say, again, off the top of my head, I think probably the nearest term way of dealing with it would be to see if we can't get some coverage for those lands in the agricultural agreement that's being worked on.
All right. Sounds good, unless we have to be subject to 2 CCAAs and all that, but we'll cross that bridge maybe when we come to it. It's something to really keep on top of, though. I know ditches are a huge thing for many. Joe Triplett, do you want to go ahead? And I'll go back to Joe from Anoka's question.
Thanks, Carol. For some reason, I just get the spinning wheel of death when I try and click on the chat box. Just one question, being ever the eternal Mr. Sunshine, the weak but still there federal nexus part of Chris's slide just gets me wondering a little bit, is there, heaven forbid, a way out of the agreement? Keeping in mind that Chisago County we are going to do the CCAA, but that little federal nexus thing sort of has me wondering. Thanks.
Yep, and I can chime in. So the CCAA is a voluntary agreement, and so the application and the paperwork that goes along with that includes ways out of the agreement, and it's at any time. And so the county can submit in writing. I think it's a 30-day process that you're gonna remove yourself from coverage. So yeah, you can come and go. The issue is if the Monarch does get listed and you remove yourself for coverage, you at that point would not be able to get back in, because you can only sign on to the agreement before the listing takes effect. And so at that point, you would need to seek coverage through one of the processes that allow post-listing enrollment. Does that make sense?
Yep, thanks, Chris. Again, just a worst case scenario scorched earth thing, but thought I'd ask. Thanks.
Yep.
That's page 54 of the CCAA document. Termination of certificate of inclusion by partner. Exactly what Chris said, 30 days notice, but you'll no longer be eligible to re-enroll if the Monarch's been listed. Joe from Anoka asked about if there's a roadway corridor that you've pledged to implement conservation measures on, but you have a reconstruct project, how does that impact the environmental permitting process? Can you shift your conservation commitment efforts to a new roadway segment? And as Chris answered in the chat, definitely yes, you can do that. And I know in our case of using sort of rotational mowing, I think is maybe the right term. I assume that one thing we might do is have 2 or 3 times the amount of adopted area that is, these are areas that on some years this will be our adopted area. So I see Darren points out though that it would be a good idea to avoid areas where you have a future project. That's a good point. But then there is the flexibility. Nick, what is the purpose of the CCAA fees for participating counties? Chris has been, I don't know, Chris, if you want to talk to that, but I thought there was a pretty good explanation. I probably could even show it on the screen here of how those fees are set and used to cover the cost of the University of Illinois Chicago's overseeing all of this. Basically, we're getting the benefit of their being the permit holder and doing all the associated legwork and tracking and reporting to the Fish and Wildlife Service. So it's to cover their costs, is my understanding. I don't know, Chris, if you have any other comments on that.
Yeah, no, that's correct. So UIC is that, overall permit holder. And so they're, collecting all these annual reports from all the folks that have signed on to the agreement, and they're, consolidating that into a bigger, agreement level report to Fish and Wildlife Service. They're certainly providing customer service to those that are enrolled. And I know that they've already hired a couple new staff to help with the CCAA program. I do also know that it was a very difficult challenge for them to really assess how much it was going to cost them to manage the program. And so they tried, they certainly made several assumptions, but they tried to keep it as reasonable as possible. It hasn't been discussed much lately, but as UIC was initially rolling out their kind of fee schedule, there had been some discussion about, maybe in the future, as the true cost to administer this program, is better understood, there could be some decreases in fees, but it's still a very new program. Most of the folks that have already signed on, they went through an application process and didn't sign on officially until the latter half of 2020. But it is paying for staff time, administrative time, that sort of thing. I'm sure there's overhead built in there, but yeah, and that's the answer.
I don't know if it's working. I'm trying to show that sheet of the calculation spreadsheet.
Yep, we can see your slide.
Okay. Is then the, all right, I'm gonna stop sharing that. See if that worked. Let's see. Randy, just comment. Oh, no need to respond. Okay.
I can speak to that a little bit if you want, though, because others might, have similar thoughts. And so I would just add that, while certainly climate change is, impacts, everything on the planet, there's actually been quite a lot of research on monarchs and trying to, determine what the causal agent is for the decline. So looking at not just the correlation, but the actual causal mechanism. And milkweed loss from the landscape has been kind of implicated as the primary driver for monarch decline. So pre-Roundup ready crops, there were billions more milkweed stems growing, interspersed between the rows of soybeans and corn. And that's no longer the case. So literally billions of stems have been lost in the last couple decades. And that is one of the reasons why agriculture is going to have to be a big part of the solution. But, so I don't think it's just climate change. I think in this particular case, we have pretty good evidence that it's actually habitat loss in the form of milkweed stem reduction.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Good point. Rich Sanders mentions, how do we get the railroads to help? With a couple of thumbs up here, as their right of way would be perfect for monarchs as well.
If anybody has ideas, as you probably all know, they're a tough group to get in front of and work collaboratively with. I do know Iris at the University of Illinois Chicago is trying very hard to get some railroads on board. I think there are at least a couple that are are paying attention and are in the conversation, but they're a tough group to get through to.
Yep. There was that presentation at the MCDA annual conference a year or two ago. I remember I wrote down the guy's name because he claimed that he would be helpful. But anyway, there's a question of, would there ever be an end to the CCAA agreement and accompanying fees? Would it end if the Monarch was taken off the list? Two things on that. One, there is in the agreement the option for termination of the permit by the program administrator, or revocation of the permit by the service is covered in there as something that could happen. But I'm guessing what Joe's getting at is, like, is this money we have to pay forever? Is there any end in sight? And especially if it's listed and then delisted. Any comments on that, Chris?
Yeah, I have the dogs barking in the background, but I'll try to talk over them. I do think that if the species was listed and then later delisted, that I think, again, you'd have to assess the risk of a relisting or a court reversing a delisting. But assuming there was very little risk, then you could certainly, remove yourself from the agreement and quit paying those fees. On the flip side, let's say that, a lot of proactive conservation happens. You're enrolled in the CCAA, 2024 rolls around and the monarch's not listed. Again, you would have to kind of do those calculations. At what point is the risk so low that you could, unenroll yourself and feel pretty safe in that decision? Or, I guess another option would be if the species went extinct, then certainly you would no longer need to be enrolled in the agreement.
There must be a mail carrier at your house setting off the.
I think it was UPS or FedEx or something. So.
Mail carrier. So, Dan asked if we could go over the annual fees a little bit more and the difference between 5% and 10% enrolled. And then another question. So I'm going to see if I can share this desktop again. Is that showing the partner fee calculator?
Yes.
Okay. So, because within this, so you plug in your acres, which, and your adopted acres is the key thing. If I increase this, and I'm trying to think, okay, so there's a target and the contributed. What if we did almost twice as many acres? I got to look at what we're looking at for costs. It's like currently the annual rate is $79.46. See if this works. If I plug that in, I think it automatically. No, didn't knock it down there. There's someplace else you have to put in the claim for your exceeding your adopted acres by hand, I guess. Because we've gone from 5 to 10 or to 7% or percent exceeded. I'm not going to get into the details here, but I guess the point is you do qualify for these cost, this calculated deductions. And the easiest thing to do is just play around with a spreadsheet. And most of us are engineering nerds and would rather be playing with a spreadsheet than talking to people anyway. I'm just kidding, but it is a pretty well done spreadsheet. And we used it to realize that the savings from the supplemental measures, it's a few $100 a year. It's not a lot. But some of the supplemental measures, like say invasive species prevention, BMPs, those are things that will save us money anyway. Doing better at making sure that we're educating staff on cleaning mowers between sites or things like that. Staff education, invasive species control costs money, and so things that are zero or no cost are probably worth doing. But what I found is anything that costs more than a few $100s a year, you're probably not going to make the money back in it. So I don't know if that answered that
Carol?
question. Yeah.
This is Sean. There's another tab. I think it might be that sliding scale, how you closed it.
Oh, sorry. Yep.
The sliding scale references tab, I think, kind of explains that.
Right. There is one. I think maybe I'll go back to that if we have more time. Is there an incentive to partner with neighboring counties to reduce these costs in the long run? From what I can tell, you would save the application fee that say it's probably it's $2,000 for a smaller county. I think if you're under 500 acres maybe of adopted, but between two counties, you'd probably be at 3,000. So you'd be splitting that initial fee. And again, you could really easily play around with a calculator and putting your acres together to see how it affects the annual fees. But like Dan, you put in your comment, having one staff person that just does the monitoring and the report right there, you're gonna save quite a bit on just coming up to speed and that type of thing. So I think if you have a county that or one or more counties that you're real comfortable working with, it's something to think about. Rob pointed out that St. Louis County included gravel pits in our enrolled acres. And I think your question is, are you going to use them as adopted acres and use conservation measures? That's another example of something where we would like to be doing more. Ideally, we would be being a little bit more prompt and complete about closing out played out portions of gravel pits, in which case, and seeding them with native seeds so that they don't become big invasive weed growing sites. So that is an option. We could use those. I think we talked about that with Chris and maybe even Iris early on. So that is an option. So yeah, doing restoration and then counting those areas. That being said, I think we might come up with at most, something like 50 or 100 acres of that 800 at the most. And seeding is expensive, so it would have to be a while we're at it, having multiple benefits to, especially to close out an old pit and sell it maybe. Rich, we have a couple of gravel pits that we lease to landowners to graze. Are we still able to do this? I assume what you're talking about is include them in the CCAA. And I think part of the question is, Chris, is if the gravel pit is not an active pit, might be splitting hairs. Is claiming it as a transportation related a big stretch, or something that on a case-by-case basis the county could kind of decide?
Yeah, I mean, my gut is that it probably needs to be looked at a bit at the case-by-case basis. So again, just going back to the comment or the question earlier, lands have to have either a transportation or energy purpose. In previous conversations about gravel pits, if you can clearly document or articulate that the gravel pit had been used for a transportation purpose prior to it being kind of used up or set aside, I think there's a good chance that you could include it in your enrolled acres. And then as far as the grazing, it really, I think, kind of comes down to how the grazing is being conducted. And I know the CCAA covers grazing, but because we don't use it really at all on MnDOT right away, I'm not as familiar with what it says specific to grazing. Certainly grazed lands can be enrolled, but whether or not they qualify for adopted acres is really going to, I think, depend on, the stocking rate, how many cattle do you have out there, what sort of, quality habitat is persisting with that grazing. But so yeah, I think you have to kind of look at it a bit case by case.
This, let me see if I can get this to work. Switch. Hopefully you're seeing a slide that shows the enrollment process. This was something that was presented at part of the first webinar. And I wanted to point out, it might be useful to look at these steps, but especially the second one is to request a pre-application meeting with the UIC, University of Illinois, Chicago. I scheduled ours for February 8th. I hope that's okay, Jim. I forgot to mention to you. But anyway, I was going to ask if Mel is still on, if you could say anything about what you guys discussed at that pre-application meeting, if that might not be where a person would find out, be able to run past their idea of like, well, can we use these certain gravel pits, for example, as adopted acres?
Yes, I'm still on, and we did ask a lot of those questions, and basically where we were was, so we just reduced it to just looking at roadways because it seemed like to be the most easily answered in a transportation purpose. And so our step process was to just use our roadways with the idea that maybe as we would phase in some of these more accepted, obvious areas like gravel pits or even ditch buffers, if it ever becomes an option, or public-private partnerships, because I've got quite a few of those around some of these lakes areas. So, but one thing, since I'm on the phone or unmuted, could you remind me again, like one of very early on was the myth of the road right away, because I do get a lot of comments about, don't they all just get killed if you use road right away? Could somebody maybe respond to that again for me? That'd be great.
I'm trying to roll way back up, sorry.
Yeah, maybe let me start and Carol jump in, because I know you've thought a bit about this. So there's a fair bit of research, and it seems like there's new studies coming out fairly regularly that kind of address this question. Kind of within the world of ecology, it's often referred to as, our roadsides, or name whatever habitat you're talking about. Are they a source or are they a sink? So are you attracting individuals to an area, and that is actually resulting in a net decrease in the number of individuals that particular area produces? And there's been a fair amount of research on this with pollinators It's not a uniform answer because nothing's ever simple in ecology, but given the monarch butterfly's biology, they're migratory, they lay quite a few eggs relative to some other pollinators. They, as an adult, have a relatively short lifespan minus that generation that migrates, but within the season that's relatively short. Roadsides are thought to be a net producer or a source, or there's a few different other terminologies. So as Carol mentioned earlier, say, your roadside produces 500 butterflies because it's great habitat with milkweed, and 10% of them get hit by cars. It's still a net producer because you're producing, 90% that survive, and that number is larger than if the roadside was low quality habitat. Another angle to this that has started to have some research published recently is there's actually evidence that if your roadside is higher quality, that some of these pollinating insects actually cross the road less often. And intuitively that makes sense because they're meeting their needs in a smaller area. But there's actually some qualitative and quantitative data that supports that idea that, if they have their resources available on one side of the road, the probability is less that they cross the road. Now, certainly they still cross the road some, but, big picture, there's fewer road crossings. And so there's kind of a couple different ways that I personally respond to that question. And it kind of depends on the questioner and how detailed they want to get into it. But I usually just say that, there's, a pretty good body of research showing that roadsides are net producers of monarchs. I don't usually generalize and say all pollinators because it's not true for all pollinators, but for monarchs, that seems to be what the data have found. Carol, you have more you want to add to that?
I just think it sounds like a good reason I should sit on the side of the road and watch monarchs for a day.
Yeah, and I can add one more thing. So we actually have a MnDOT funded research project looking at small animal road mortality issues, and monarchs and pollinators were certainly not a big component of that research project. But since we had researchers out collecting roadkill at a number of sites around the Twin Cities metro, we had them collect monarch mortality information, and it's actually fairly low. Now, where road mortality has been implicated as possibly a bigger issue is down in Texas. So what happens is, up in the northern part of their breeding range, they're fairly, distributed across the landscape. And then in the fall, they start to flock together and migrate south. And by the time they get to Texas, they're in these, groups of, hundreds of thousands of butterflies. And so down in Texas, it's possible on a Texas interstate that a semi truck could fly through or could drive through, a big flock of monarch butterflies and kill, 1,000 of them in a pass. But they don't form those, really large groups at where we occur in their range. And so at least in Minnesota, it doesn't seem like road mortality is significant from a population standpoint.
All right. Would trail infrastructure qualify for adopted acres? I'm just gonna, I don't know if this shows the migration path that Chris is talking about and why Texas would be a crunch spot.
Yeah, and so to the trail question, it's a good one. I think it probably depends a little bit on case by case. Certainly trail that's within a road right away can count, without a doubt. I think you would have a pretty good chance of getting some sort of regional trail included in an application, because I think you could make an argument that it's a transportation use. A regional trail presumably is being used by, bicyclists and walkers and things to get, from one place to another. Where you may run into issues is if it's, a loop trail that doesn't really go anywhere other than, around some, urban park or something like that. That may be a bit of a gray area, but generally speaking, I think trails are possible to be included. I don't know, Carol, or if anybody else has asked that particular question.
I'm actually looking in my email from early December, and I have one from you to me saying that, yes, we should be able to include bike and ped trails even outside the right of way. And I thought you had asked that to Iris.
Yeah, I did ask it to Iris, but again, it was kind of the, a regional trail idea, because when I asked it, I said, can a trail that is clearly serves a transportation purpose be included, even if it's outside of a road right away? And they're like, as long as it has a transportation purpose. And so, like I said, I think the gray area would be a trail to nowhere. It's just a loop around some park or something. But that's the nice thing about the CCAA is it does try to build in as much flexibility as possible. And when you submit your application, you can certainly, submit an application that tries to include, everything in the kitchen sink. And, it's possible UIC may, kind of follow up and say, well, maybe not this, but I think if you can justify it as a transportation use, I don't see any reason why you couldn't.
All right. Well, I don't see anything else in the chat, and we are coming up on 3 o'clock. I think I want to live just like 1 minute real quick. Is there anybody else, especially that was on the committee, that is dying to say something that, we missed, or any other thoughts? I'll count to 10. Hearing none. That's fine. I just didn't want to hog all the time.
Carol, I do have one more comment that might be good, but I've done plenty of talking, so I want to give other folks a chance if there is something.
I think you're good.
Okay. So another aspect that we didn't really get into that folks should be aware of is you have to enroll before a species gets listed, but after you enroll, you can modify your lands. And so just be aware that you do have the option to enroll only a subset of your, county roads. And then if the species gets listed, you are then technically able to enroll additional lands. The other aspect that we didn't really get into is that the CCAA covers, reconstruction. The CCAA calls it modernization, but it covers, construction that is more or less within the same, right-of-way footprint. And it also covers maintenance. And you don't have to sign on and do both of those. And so actually MnDOT, when we signed on, we only included our modernization activities, primarily because we have a fair bit of work to do internal surrounding maintenance activities. We just don't have the same level of kind of oversight and scrutiny of our maintenance activities. And so we thought we needed more time to figure out how to handle maintenance. And so just be aware that there is, again, that flexibility.
Good point. I think there is, for significant changes or amendments, a fee, right?
Yeah. So yeah, if you would need to update, kind of your application, then you would pay that application fee again. So there is a cost, but there's also the benefit of getting your foot in the door and maybe keeping some of the things simple as possible in preparation of a listing, right, versus just kind of going all in at once. But again, you'll have to kind of weigh, the pros and cons to your organization, and maybe that won't be as big a concern for some of the counties.
Super. All right. Well, I think we should probably wrap it up. If people have questions, I will put my email in the chat box. Otherwise, you can funnel them through Brian or who's taking over for Jody. See if I typed that right. All right. Have a good one. Take care.
Thanks, Carol, for all your work. Bye.
Yes.